This is a presumed portrait, by the way, that's in a painting of his, presumed self-portrait. We don't know. But he's the first painter that we're covering who did not make his living as an artist. And he's also the first painter that we've covered. Well, to some extent this applies to Bruegel, but not as much as Vermeer, who was forgotten for centuries. It's because he lived in Delft, which was an important town, not far from Rotterdam, and about 50 miles south of Amsterdam. And it had its own canal, so it was, it was part of the whole trade that was going on in Holland at the time. But it was a city of about between 25 and 40,000 people. And he never got to be known outside of his city, Delft. So after he died, his reputation hadn't spread enough for anyone to follow up on him or to remember him in the later histories. And it actually took a couple of scholars 200 years after his death to resurrect him and begin searching out his work. And much of it had been, by this time, attributed to other artists. So it was actually a bit of a job, and there's still a lot of dispute about his painting. The reason he didn't have to make his living as a painter is because his father owned an inn. And when his father died, he took over the inn, which was also a tavern. And he also took over something else his father did, which was he trade in paintings, which was quite common. Rubens and Rembrandt both collected and sold artworks. And made a considerable amount of their income that way. And Vermeer did the same thing. Now, his father died when he was in his 20s in 1652. And in 1653, he marries a Catholic girl whose mother insisted that he convert to Catholicism, which is a significant fact, because the Catholics were not very popular in Protestant Holland in those days. And he moved in with his mother-in-law within a year or so, and her house was connected to a secret Jesuit church, which is significant for understanding his early paintings. Here's a view of his Delft, by him, a marvelous painting, one of the two cityscapes we have by him. And you can see it had a large canal that linked it with commerce throughout Holland and throughout the world, actually. It had been brewers had been the major industry, but they were switching over to pottery at this time. But it was a prosperous city, and a bunch of artists moved there, actually. Now, the year, so in 53, he joined the Guild of St. Luke, which is the Guild of Artists Guild. He didn't pay any fees because it was a plague year. The next year, I mean, this was a time of incredible happenings in Holland. The next year, before I do that, I want to show you another image of Delft by another artist who I'll mention briefly. This is a painting by Fabricius. We only have about 8 of this artist's paintings. And it's a wide-angle view of Delft, which is kind of interesting. Fabricius was a carpenter who became a student of Rembrandt's and then set up on his own in Delft, and was a very gifted and very original painter. And this, you can see the canal here, one of the canals here. And the canals were tree-lined. It was a very attractive city. So But the next year, 1654, there was what was known as the Delft thunderclap. A quarter of the city blew up. They were producing munitions, and the munitions factory blew up and took out a quarter of the city. It also took out Fabricius, the Rembrandt student, who would have briefly known, known Vermeer. And in fact, if you look at this one of his other paintings, a very famous one of his, you'll see that he clearly had something of an influence on it. The lighting in this is very similar to Vermeer's paintings. The Goldfinch by Fabricius.
I just watched that movie last night.
Yeah.
It's such a
You
wonderful
watch what?
I watched the movie The Goldfinch on Amazon.
Oh, okay.
Literally just watched it last night. It's hilarious.
Oh, okay. Well, this is a gem of a painting. And it has colors which are related to some of Vermeer's more muted paintings. Unfortunately, as you may know, I haven't seen the painting, The Goldfinch. Fabricius, not only he perished in the explosion, but most of his work, which is very sad. He was in his 20s. I think he was 25.
Where did the explosion happen?
It happened in 1654, a year after Vermeer had joined the Guild of St. Luke, the Painters Guild.
Mm-hmm.
Now, before we look at more of his paintings, I want to. He's painting in the late Baroque period, at a point when Caravaggio is known throughout Europe, and many of his works traveled through Holland. But a painting like this, again, has the light and a lot of the quality of Vermeer. So it's interesting to see that. But
I'm sorry.
even
Did you say that's Caravaggio?
That's Caravaggio. It's early Caravaggio, yes.
Wow, it's so different. Okay.
Yes, Caravaggio went through a period early on. He lived in Rome doing still lives for wealthy patrons. It took him a while to get a commission where he could really show what he could do with the figure. But here's one, and then before he did his big paintings for the churches, he did, this is again Caravaggio, he did paintings like this, which are very closely related, if you think about it, to what Vermeer will do. We'll see some paintings of Vermeer's that are very similar to this. This is the fortune teller, who's actually out to rob this young man. He did several variations on this. It was this genre, type of genre painting that he did. Very realistic genre painting, was new at the time. Caravaggio pretty much invented it. But these paintings, some of them, not all of them, of course, but some of them would have been familiar, to Vermeer and to the other Dutch artists, including Rembrandt, who was so influenced by him. So here is one of Vermeer's earliest paintings after his marriage, the earliest one we know of, and actually one of his largest paintings, and quite uncharacteristic, but very Caravaggesque. Now, this painting has another significance. It's a religious painting at a time when religious paintings were not selling in Holland. So we think that it was commissioned for a secret church, Catholic church, because he was now a secret Catholic, married to a Catholic girl. And apparently took on Catholicism very enthusiastically. But this is a story from the New Testament where Christ stopped at a house and talked to two women, Martha and Mary, not Mary his mother or Mary Magdalene, just a Martha and a Mary. And it illustrates the debate between the Catholics and the Protestants. I'm getting an echo. Are you getting an echo from me?
Yeah.
I'm really sorry about that. I don't know what is doing that. Maybe I should turn down the volume a little tiny bit. I don't know.
I can hear you clear now.
Yeah, okay.
Do you have any devices close to the computer, any electronic devices, Anthony? Sometimes that'll do it. Like a cell phone or
Yeah, I just moved my cell phone. Anyway, Martha represents Catholic devotion where you have to do good works, and she's clearly working here. And Mary, who's just adoringly listened to Christ, represents the Protestant point of view, which is faith alone was enough to gain salvation. You didn't have to do good works. You didn't have to go and, be constantly forgiven by the priest. So anyway, then another genre painting, which also has, it's not so much like Caravaggio because he's gone a little bit wild with the colors in a way that Caravaggio wouldn't. And here, this is assumed to be his self-portrait, but it's known as the procuress. There's a woman who's probably the procuress dressed as a nun. If this is Vermeer, he has himself dressed as a musician. And some people think this is his wife, actually, and her brother playing the the man who's seeking the attentions of this woman who's handing her coin here. But a lot of authorities think that it was he and his family who posed for this. And that is somewhat, which seems kind of unlikely at first, but then in his mother-in-law's collection was this painting, which you would have known very well, which I think is a superior painting. But the procuress, again, she's working out a price here. So I didn't say earlier that because of the because he was lost for 200 years, we know almost nothing. We have almost no information about his life, so we have to surmise almost everything. This is one of his early, this is a painting by the artist who actually invented the Dutch genre, Van Hooch, invented the Dutch genre painting, and who was also in Delft and would have, and he and Vermeer had a sort of rivalry. And you can see there are a lot of the elements of Vermeer's painting in this painting. But it was Van Hooch who actually developed this genre and made it very popular there. He also did cityscapes. This one is quite a lovely one. And is interesting in how it actually relates a little bit. It's the same year as Vermeer's famous Little Street. But if you contrast them, you can see how beautifully balanced Vermeer's painting is compared to the Hooch, and how just the clarity of the painting. The research has been done, and it's assumed that they think that this location, they found the location. If this was the location, it was 2 houses down from his aunt, who had a tripe shop, and diagonally across the street from where his mother and his sister lived. So this was a man, a very domestic man who didn't stray very far from the fold in his painting life. Of course, it's a man who was incredibly busy if he was running an inn, tavern, and also trading in artwork. And had, at this point, as his life went on, he had 10 children.
There's something about there's like a cleanness to the palette or something. They're almost like just popping off the canvas.
He pays a lot of attention to light, and he carries it as far as he can. The contrast, and he uses some very pure colors. This is a marvelous painting, which they've discovered that this was for a long time thought to be a Rembrandt. Underneath this area here is a painting of Cupid, which they're uncovering very carefully. And that's the giveaway that she's got a love letter. And she's in a domestic situation. She's got a bowl of spilled fruit here. Symbolically, that food is related to passion. And this bowl of spilled fruit suggests that this is not her husband who wrote to her, that she has a lover that she's thinking about as she reads the letter. But beautifully composed. Look at how this red moves right down and actually repeats, this curve repeats the curve of the back of her neck, and then follows down here. And the letter is sort of picking up, almost like picking up the light that would be falling like this. It's also one of the first paintings. It's hard to see, but he has these little beads of light here and there in it, which has one of the things that caused people to think he was using a camera obscura, which we'll discuss further later. But that's the beginning of the paintings where he uses this room. It was a room, he had two small rooms in his mother-in-law's house in the front of the house, which was his studio. Now, this woman is probably looking at herself in a mirror next to the window here. Oh my goodness. You know what, Cassandra? I forgot to start recording this.
Recording.
Say that again?
I'm recording.
You knew I was going to do that, didn't you?
No, I just in case, just a backup.
Wow, thank you. Okay, anyway, going on here. The necklace is a symbol of purity, and it's kind of interesting that I don't think we know a lot about the significance of this painting, but it's a very beautiful painting and very restrained palette. And this is the first time we see this jacket, which appears throughout his entire career. It appears again and again because he loved this yellow. And he often played it off against a strong blue. Here, there's just a little bit of blue in this black. But the austerity of this palette is really quite something. Most of these paintings are quite small. This, of course, is a very famous painting. We know nothing about it, despite the book and the film that were made. Girl with the Pearl Earring. I'm sorry that it's not as high resolution as it should have been. But here you see him using his favorite colors, the blue against the yellow. And the blue, as I mentioned earlier, was lapis lazuli. Most painters couldn't afford it, but he uses it generously in his work, because this is a man who probably had quite a big income between his inn, his trading in art all over Europe, as well as selling his few paintings that he did for a lot of money when he sold them. So he could afford that expenditure. He had, I think, very expensive tastes, and he's a real bourgeois, haute bourgeois in his tastes for the most part. Though, oh my goodness, I jumped. I'm sorry. Wait, I'm gonna move back. Okay, I skipped some paintings here, which are very important because this is earlier in his career. And it shows his ability to do a incredibly dignified and beautiful genre painting. This is it's known as the milkmaid, but it's actually a household maid. And in Dutch society, maids were, in painting at least, maids were often seen as objects of pleasure for the gentleman viewing the paintings. And there were a lot of symbols relating to that. This one, though, is interesting because Vermeer has pushed those symbols, which were all usually very visible in the painting, to the far background. There's a little Cupid in the Delft tile here. And there's this warmer, which would often be actually to warm yourself up. You'd stand over it with your skirt to warm up your body. But consequently, it was often seen as a symbol of lust and the passion with the coals in the warmer. But here they're pushed to the background, and he's really giving attention to her as a very attentive domestic servant who's she's making a custard where you soak old bread in egg, you put it in a container like this, and then you pour milk over it and bake it. It's a very traditional dish, making use of stale bread. But it's a beautiful painting, I think. It's one of my favorite, actually. And he's playing, again, his favorite yellow against a lot of lapis lazuli here. And the greens are actually, it's not a green that he's using. He's mixing the yellow with the blue to make these muted greens. This is an early one of his more ambitious paintings, the music lesson. The man here it's hard to see, but has his mouth slightly open as if he's singing while she's playing. But again, the room that he's used for so many of his paintings is very visible in this picture. But what's different, and he does this occasionally, he's straying into the strong reds. As he does in this painting. This is attributed to him. I wonder a little about this painting. I don't know what other people think. It seems there's things going on in this painting that make me think that it may not be Vermeer. The diagonal placement of the chair, the kind of slightly chaotic elements here which don't quite balance, and the window has a stained glass which apparently extols the virtues of abstinence, and here she is being plied by him with wine. He's clearly a musician. You wonder if this was actually de Hooch's and not Vermeer's. I don't know. I think it's an interesting painting. Now this is a painting which illustrates his acceptance of Catholicism. It was the Jesuits who ran the secret church that he would have attended, and the Jesuits, had a statement where he said that all good Catholics should each day weigh their bad deeds against their good deeds. and view each day as the day of judgment. And behind her is the day of judgment, a painting of the day of judgment. And the scales here that she's using symbolize that process. So there, oh, and she's pregnant, clearly pregnant, which is interesting. And I don't know. And this little bit of yellow orange here is repeated up here. I'm not sure how to read that, but it's interesting. There's a lot going on under the surface in his paintings. And then we did the necklace, so I'll go on. Oh yeah, there's this one, which is one of my favorite portraits of his, actually, because it's so incredibly alive. It doesn't have the reserve of many of his portraits. She seems to be directly relating to the viewer, and the handling of the light on her face and on her clothing here is and what looks like, well, I'm not sure if that's the top of a musical instrument or not. It looks like it might be. Musical instruments appear over and over again in his work. Obviously, music was very important. He was clearly a man of very refined tastes, and in my opinion, probably a devoted family man. Now, this is one that, for some reason, Salvador Dali loved this one. It's the lace maker. And it's apparently, if you know anything about making lace, it's very, very perfectly staged in terms of the process. Also, you notice the foreground fabric here is slightly out of focus, which also lends credence to the idea that some of the time he might. My own feeling about the whole dispute as to whether he used a camera oscura, which he could have done because it existed at the time, is that he probably looked for it like many artists did, might have used it sometimes for the drawing, but I think it would have been made life harder than painting directly from life to use it for the whole painting. But it seems to have influenced his vision, as it did many artists. Now, this is another artist interpretation of the same subject, the lace maker. But you can see the difference between what Vermeer is doing and what many of his contemporaries are doing. He's creating this, there's an architecture to his paintings that takes in the whole canvas and takes in the whole space. Here we have a portrait of someone, but he's doing a lot more than that. He's placing them in a space, and he's creating a very complex composition which everything interacts with everything else. Though this is a lovely painting. Is an interesting genre piece. Again, notice the jacket. But here, the treatment of the maid could come right out of Caravaggio. And also the dark background. If anyone has any comments to interject as we go along, please, interrupt me. But there's a strong interaction there, which you often don't see in his paintings, and also the sense of a story, which isn't as clear as in this one, usually. Now, there are two paintings which, and this is the first of the two, which are very similar to one another. This one's called The Astronomer, and he's studying a star map, very intent on it. And there's you almost think of some of Rembrandt's paintings when you look at this because of the darkness and the focus of the light. But there is some discussion as to who this person is, because he appears again in, just a second, The Geographer. It's almost certainly the same man. And these two paintings were actually painted on the same mold of canvas. We know that. They were cut from the same piece of canvas. This is The Geographer. Well, what's interesting about this is that a lot of people have identified this man as being Antony van Leeuwenhoek, who is very famous because he used a very primitive microscope that he developed to study and, well, to discover and then study the organisms that he saw in water, which was something no one knew existed before. He was the first one. In fact, and he wrote a whole bunch of letters to a friend at the Royal Academy, the Royal Society in London, and they finally gave him membership in the society because they were so impressed by what he discovered and by his work. But he was, at the time this painting was painted, he was 36, and he was studying to be a surveyor. And he took the exam this year and passed the surveyor's exam this same year. So there is some reason to think that it might actually be him in these two paintings, and that he and Vermeer knew each other. There's another piece of evidence that comes up later. But here he is painted 20 years later by another artist. And, there's some similarity in the face, even in the expression in the face. And going back to The Geographer for just a moment here, wait a minute, there it is. There's a famous painting by, a famous print by Rembrandt. Now, these two men are almost they're turned in the opposite direction, but their pose and their relation to the window is quite similar. And of course, Vermeer would have known, he's a contemporary, and he would have known Rembrandt, and he would have seen it. He would have seen this print. Rembrandt, like several other artists we've discussed, became famous throughout Europe, not for his paintings, which were mostly bought and sold in Holland, but for his prints, which spread throughout Europe and made him immensely famous.
What is the type? The type on both of us have a specific type?
Oh, this is Faustus here. And I mean, he's not a geographer at all. This is Faustus, and it's something, God knows what it is. It's some Latin relating to some formula that gives him the power to, who knows? I'm not sure. I wish I knew. I could have done more study of this, but what interested me was the similarity in.
Yeah, because the other one has type on the wall. I wasn't sure what that said either.
Oh yeah. Well, I can. Let me see. Just going back here to the geography.
Or, I don't know, something.
That is.
Year.
Yeah, that's actually Vermeer dating it. He considered it significant enough. He only dated like 2 or 3 paintings actually. And all the tools that a geographer would have, and there's a globe up here, of course. So it's definitely a meditation on this particular trade.
That's cool.
Or yeah, it's a beautiful painting, and kind of strays a little. Well, it's got the blues and the yellows, but the red it strays a little bit from what we think of his paintings as being. This is a late painting. Now, in 1672, Louis XIV invaded Holland with a massive army. And this is the year this is painted, actually.
Oh.
And the only way that the Dutch were able to stop him was they flooded most of their country. But in the process, they destroyed their economy.
Mm.
The war wasn't over then. It just gave them time to marshal their forces and be willing to fight him on equal terms. The war went on for 6 years and was incredibly destructive. But it led to the beginning of huge financial difficulties for Vermeer, because he was trading all over art in Europe in art, and all of a sudden he couldn't trade anymore.
Right.
And I would imagine that his inn was not as busy as it would have been. And he probably couldn't sell his own paintings. So it started to create a real crisis for him. So this is it's kind of an interesting painting to see. There are things about it that are different from his other paintings. The figure is more relaxed. The painting is not as balanced. And for my taste, the relief on the guitar, this is the first, a guitar was a new instrument. It's actually a departure from the more traditional instruments that he usually painted. The picture frame back here, to me, is incredibly distracting in this painting. And it makes me, it's clearly by Vermeer, but it lacks the balance that we see in most of his work. And one wonders if it had to do with the surrounding circumstances. I don't know. It's a lovely painting.
Is it a commission or like
Most of his painting, a lot of his paintings of figures were not commissions. We don't know because we have no records. I'm of the opinion that a lot of the women were his family.
Right.
That this could have been his daughter. But
she looks very much like the one with the necklace, doesn't she?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Just her face and like the sallow kind of coloring of her skin.
Yeah. It's a beautiful painting, though, and it really engaging painting. Now, the last painting I'm going to show, which was done late in his career, we don't know exactly when, but it's his most ambitious, it's his largest painting outside of that first one I showed you. And it's about a painter and his studio and his model, and it's quite symbolic. This young woman here, well, in those days, the inspiration for painting was considered music and poetry, and she's holding both. But she's also she's represented here as the muse of painting, with the leaves in her hair here. And many people speculate that this is actually a self-portrait.
Right.
And it would be quite characteristic of Vermeer, who had a secret life as a Catholic, that he wouldn't show us his face. He would show us his back. It's a superb painting, and of his group paintings, I think it's the most, to me, it's the most well resolved.
You say it's a pretty large painting?
For him, let's see if I wrote down the size. I may not have. Well, I do remember. It's about 4 feet by 3.5, which was the largest he ever worked. Most of his paintings were in the 18-inch range. They were. It seems like he had 1 or 2 collectors who bought most of what he painted. We're not sure who they were. There's a theory about one man in particular, but we don't know for sure. Because by the time people started to get really interested in his work, the paintings had been sold and resold over 200 years. So, and many of them attributed to other artists. This has some other, it has a map of Holland in the background here. with the sitters along the side pattern. And there's a very strong crease right at the border between Catholic and Protestant Holland. Is that significant? We don't know.
That's awesome.
There's so much we don't know because he never had anything to tell us. Anyway, in 1675, 3 years after the outbreak of the war, at a point when the British had started to invade as well, there were 3 wars between Holland and Britain, and this was the 3rd war. The British decided to come in on the side of the French. So Holland was in total crisis. His business completely crashed. He'd borrowed an enormous amount of money, 1,000 guilders, from a silk merchant, and he put up his mother-in-law's house as security. And then this is what his wife has to say, because all of a sudden, just like that, in his 40s, he dies. She said, during the ruinous war with France, he not only was unable to sell any of his art, but also, to his great detriment, was left sitting with the paintings of other masters that he was dealing in. As a result, and owing to the great burden of his children having no means of his own, he lapsed into such a decay and decadence, which he had so taken to heart that, as if he had fallen into a frenzy, in a day and a half, he went from being healthy to being dead. Rather sad. This was a man in the height of his powers who was kind of caught in the vice of events way beyond his control. And it's a story, I mean, it's the story of a lot of artists, actually, though this is one of the more extreme examples. You know, the vagaries of, this is the difference between the artists of the lowlands and the artists of Italy. The artists of Italy that we've covered until this point could all rely on patronage from the church and from very wealthy patrons who at times couldn't help the artists, but would return to them and would support them throughout their lives if they developed a reputation. In Holland, you were in the free market. And it had, from the very beginning, the same ups and downs that we're aware of now. In fact, they were even more treacherous in those days, as well as plagues and wars. So that to me even increases his achievement, that he could achieve something of such. What I see his work as being is a tranquil refuge from a very hard-working man's life, dealing with the business of art, an inn, which must have taken a lot of work, and a family of 10 children. But a man who loved beauty and loved the tranquility of these moments and clearly loved music, and I think probably really loved his family. A kind of bizarre note with regard to this painting. It was owned for a while by Adolf Hitler.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
The failed artist Adolf Hitler, of course.
Yeah, do you
Say that
think,
again. Say that again.
The failed artist Adolf Hitler.
Yeah, I know.
do you know who Sarah Silverman is? Sarah Silverman is a comedian, and she has this bit about being really nice to Hitler's art and really encouraging his art and how good it is. She has a whole bit about that, so he doesn't become the other thing.
Yeah, well, it's quite true that, I mean, it's not quite true, but it is possible. I mean, other artists have said this. Flamenc said, if I hadn't taken to art, I would have been throwing bombs. He was an anarchist through and through, of course. But who knows if Hitler had been encouraged as an artist? I mean, he had some skill, but not much inspiration in what we've seen of his work, what little we've seen of it. But the art school that rejected him, he was almost all the professors who rejected him were Jewish. So one wonders, doesn't one?
How would one grab all the if he got all the art? Where did he get it from? From somebody, like a person or a museum or
Pillage.
village.
as the Germans, as they moved, they were very efficient. Well, the Germans were efficient, you know, in their brutality. They knew where all the artwork probably was, and they went right for it, wherever they went. And they actually would protect places if they had, on some occasions, if they had artistic value. The Allies really had to be curbed. Our side destroyed a huge amount of stuff in its indiscriminate bombing campaign in the end of the war. But
who knows when like all the artworks, like say there's artworks that are missing, I'm sure some were destroyed. Like who knows where they?
yes, a lot. Well, some were lost. Some are still turning up.
Right.
And yeah, I mean, in most cases, the artwork had been hidden once the war, you know, really got going. But in the early days, like when they rushed into France, they didn't bomb France. They just went house to house and ransacked it. And in Germany, they just ransacked the homes of all the Jews, and took everything.
And bomb it, yeah.
I mean, I didn't actually want to end on that note, but
No. Beautiful painting.
isn't it? It is. It's just.
The curtain.
He's such a unique artist. I mean, he is a dyed-in-the-wool bourgeois artist, which is my only problem with him. I would like to see a wider range of subject matter, but he's brilliant at what he does. Brilliant.
Yeah, I just love all the paintings. And you mentioned the speculars of light.
Yeah.
And just like, you know, pertaining to Wendy's painting earlier, just like that really, you know, is the thing that really pops out of the paintings, like all the specular light metal.
Yeah.
A photorealistic touch to it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well,
Incredible.
he may be one of the first photorealists, but we'll never for sure know that. He certainly, it's clear that he did. Oh, one last item that is interesting. The person who was made the trustee of the family when they were dissolving the estate after his death, and there were huge debts to be dealt with. The person who was made the trustee, interestingly enough, was Anthony van Leeuwenhoek.
I don't know. Who's that?
That was the guy the microscopist who
Oh my God.
they think is represented in the two paintings earlier on, the geographer and the astronomer.
He was
so that's another piece of evidence that it was actually him. He clearly knew the family.
right.
But it's a small city, you know. I think pretty much everyone, all the intellectuals knew each other there, you know.
Especially the artists. He had he had everybody, yeah.
Yeah, well, the artists would have known each other because they had guilds in those days, and they all were members of the guilds. And he actually, Vermeer was the head of the guild on 4 different occasions.
Isn't the movie is it the movie about Vermeer, or is it just about the girl in the movie, the Pearl Erin?
Well, I think it's Vermeer to some extent, but I found I read the book. I haven't seen the movie. I didn't like the book. I thought, you know, there was too strong an interpretation of his character in a particular way, and I don't think we have the evidence for it. But it's, you know, I think I heard the movie was beautiful.
Oh, cool. That'll be my next movie to watch.
Okay, yeah. Tell me, I might be persuaded to watch it.
I've been watching. I watched the Van Gogh movie with the I forget the French actor's name. No, it's about Gauguin. The Gauguin movie.
The Gauguin movie was pretty good, actually.
That was really tragic. Yeah.
Yeah, it strays from fact on a number of points, but I think it does. In some ways, it does represent him fairly truthfully.
Right.
You know, the myth he created was not the reality he experienced, but that's not unusual with artists.
Yeah.
That's true of Picasso as well, you know.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, I'd recommend you guys watch the Genius Picasso thing. It's like about 10 episodes. It's awesome.
Hmm.
It's from his younger age to old age. It's pretty tragic, but it's pretty cool.
How do you mean
Thank
it's
you.
tragic?
Yeah, I thought he was a happy figure.
What I mentioned earlier, there was the National Geographic did a thing called Genius Picasso with Antonio.
Mhm. Yes. Yeah.
And just because he wanted to be the most famous artist, that comes with if you're one thing, you can't be the other. So I'll just leave it at that.
Well,
You
that's my feeling about him, actually.
want to
I
be
mean,
so
I think,
famous, you forget about everything else.
yeah. Well, there's a kind of narcissism and egotism there, which is actually a little
Yeah.
upsetting and is reflected in his treatment of the women in his life.
If you watch it, you feel angry, but you feel sad. So
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
recommend that just like an artist's life, it's pretty cool.
I know at the end of his life, when he lived in Miami, he would go to restaurants and cafes, and he would just sign the check without paying, and the signature was more than payment.
Right.
No, that wasn't, he didn't live in Miami.
Didn't he?
You're thinking of Dali.
Dali, yeah, Dali.
Oh, he never lived in the States toward the end of his life?
Picasso never came to Picasso, I mean, Spain and
France.
France were pretty much the only places he ever went.
But Dali has I've always wanted to go to that museum there in Florida. I would know that he was all about his signature for sure.
So he's the one that would pay at restaurants simply by signing the bill.
Well, no, Picasso could do that too.
Okay.
There's a period.
Just not on the Miami shore.
What happens right after the war is everyone descends on Paris because it's known as the arts center, and there's a lot of money around, and a few artists just become immensely wealthy because of the moment in history. And I mean, they were talented too. I'm not, but they weren't any more talented than the impressionists and the post-impressionists.
Like a celebrity almost.
Yeah, a celebrity, and to some degree, I think it destroyed many of them.
Sounds familiar. A lot of celebrities.
Yeah. You don't want to be that famous or that wealthy as an artist. It's not good for you.
Yeah.
I hate to tell you, because I'm not in. Most of us are not in danger of that. So.
But look at the band U2.
I wish I were in danger of it, but.
So, any other comments on what we looked at or talked about?
I just loved the palette. I
Mhm.
guess, and I saw the exhibit at the De Young and I knew less about. It was a good few years ago when Vermeer was here, and I guess I knew less about color. I was really intrigued by this kind of clean, crisp palette that he had.
I mean, he's using
and quite simple. I mean, simple but not simple, restrained or something. I don't know what it is.
He's working every possible variation of this restrained palette, which is, as I said, is very, very, very similar to Rembrandt's, except that he does use the ultramarine, the real ultramarine, which is lapis lazuli, and he favors a different part of the spectrum.
Yeah.
And a totally different quality of life in his most famous paintings. Though you can see he can do something pretty close to Rembrandt when he wants to. But yeah,
beautiful.
meticulous. Partly the scale made it easier for him to do that. He's working quite small. But yeah, they're like jewels.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Lot to live up to.
So, I guess that's it, unless anyone has anything else they want to say. And so I would suggest to everyone, whatever else you do, doing some 1 or 2 quick sketches in oil. Quick, loose as you can get. And allowing yourself to make a mess. And next week, I'll probably be doing some little demonstrations